A December morning in Melbourne should have sounded like any other. Soft footsteps echoed in the hallway. Metal trays clinked gently under the white hospital lights, while a mother breathed through pain, waiting to hear the first cry of her child. Everything about that room felt ordinary, until the baby arrived. And suddenly, the room fell silent. For one impossible second, no one moved. The doctor looked down at the newborn in his hands. A nurse beside him slowly covered her mouth, while another turned her face away, as if her eyes refused to accept what they were seeing. The child had no arms. The child had no legs. The silence inside the room grew heavier with every passing second. Nick's mother could not understand what she was seeing, and his father stood frozen beside the bed, searching for words that simply did not exist. No scan had warned them. No doctor had prepared them. The baby lying under those cold hospital lights was named Nick Vujicic. And before he had even opened his eyes to the world had already decided what he would never be able to do. But the strangest thing about that moment was not the shock in the room. It was the fact that no one standing there that morning could possibly imagine what this child would one day become. Slowly, the hospital room began to move again. Machines hummed quietly in the background while nurses returned to their routine. But something inside that room had changed forever. For several minutes, Nick's mother could not bring herself to look at him. For months, she had imagined this moment. She had imagined a healthy baby boy with tiny fingers and tiny feet, a child she could hold and watch grow like any other parent. Instead, she was staring at a reality she had never prepared herself for. A child without arms. A child without legs. The nurses gently wrapped the baby in a blanket and brought him closer to the bed. Nick's father stood there silently, staring at the tiny face of his son. Nick was crying, but inside that cry there was something else, something stronger than fear or uncertainty. Life. Not weakness. Not defeat. Just life. After a long moment, his mother slowly reached out and held him for the very first time. And in that moment, something changed. The fear was still there. The uncertainty about the future had not disappeared. But beneath all of it, something stronger quietly took its place. He was still their son. In the background, the doctors had already begun explaining the condition in careful voices. They told the parents about a rare disorder called tetra-amelia syndrome, a condition so uncommon that most doctors might never encounter it during their entire careers. It meant Nick would grow up without arms, without legs, and, most likely, without the kind of life people usually call normal. His parents listened. They heard the words, but what they were truly hearing was something else entirely. Questions. How will he eat? How will he walk? How will he go to school? How will he survive in a world that was never designed for someone like him? The doctors could not answer those questions. No one could. But what no one in that hospital room understood that day was this. The hardest battles Nick would ever face would not be physical. They would happen inside his mind. And those battles had only just begun. Nick's parents eventually brought him home. The house that once felt ordinary suddenly had to become a place of invention. Every simple task had to be reimagined. Feeding him required patience. Bathing him required creativity. Even something as small as helping him sit upright became a daily challenge. But inside that house, Nick was never treated as something fragile. His parents made a quiet decision early on. They would raise him to live, not to hide. So Nick learned. He learned how to balance his tiny body. He learned how to move, using the small foot-like limb he was born with. What most people would see as an impossible limitation slowly became the beginning of his independence. At home, love made things possible. But outside that home, the world looked very different. The first time Nick appeared in public, people stopped walking. Some stared. Some whispered. Others simply did not know where to look. Children would point at him with open curiosity, asking questions that adults were too polite or too uncomfortable to ask out loud. What happened to him? Why does he look like that? For a child, those questions can cut deeper than anyone realizes. Nick was still very young when he began to understand that he was different. Not just a little different, but different in a way the world did not easily accept. School made that truth impossible to ignore. Classrooms were not designed for a child without limbs. Desks, chairs, playgrounds, everything reminded him that the world had been built for bodies that looked nothing like his. And children can be brutally honest. Some laughed. Some stared. Some avoided him entirely, unsure of how to act around someone like Nick. At times, he tried to laugh along, pretending the comments did not hurt. But when the school day ended and the bus ride home felt too long, the silence inside his thoughts began to grow heavier. Nick had started to ask questions. Questions that no parent ever wants to hear from their child. Questions about why he had been born this way, and whether a life like his could ever truly be happy. But the most difficult part of Nick's childhood was not the stares. It was the moment he began to believe them. And that moment was still waiting for him just ahead. For a while, Nick tried to be strong. He smiled in front of people. He laughed when others laughed. Sometimes, he even made jokes about himself before anyone else could. But strength can be a fragile thing when you are still a child. Every stare stayed in his memory. Every whisper followed him home. And the quiet moments at night were often the hardest. Because when the noise of the world disappeared, the questions returned. Nick began to wonder why his life had started this way. Why other children could run across playgrounds while he had to watch from the side. Why something as simple as tying shoes or opening a door was impossible for him. One evening, those thoughts finally spilled out. Nick was sitting with his mother when he asked a question that stopped her heart for a moment. "Mom, why did God make me like this?" It was not anger in his voice. It was something much deeper. Confusion. Pain. A child trying to understand why his life looked so different from everyone else's. His mother did not answer immediately. She looked at her son for a long moment, searching for words strong enough to carry hope without pretending the pain was not real. Finally, she said something simple. "Nick, I don't know all the reasons, but I know this: God makes no mistakes." For a child, those words were hard to believe, because every day the world seemed to prove the opposite. Nick kept growing older, and as he did, the weight inside his mind grew heavier. School became harder. The stares felt sharper. The silence inside his thoughts became darker. By the time Nick reached the age of 10, the questions that once lived quietly in his mind had turned into something far more dangerous. They had turned into doubt. And that doubt would soon lead him to one of the darkest moments of his life. By the time Nick turned 10, something inside him had begun to change. From the outside, he still looked like the same boy. He went to school. He smiled when people spoke to him. He tried to keep up with the world as best as he could. But inside his mind, a quiet storm had been growing for years. Every stare he had endured. Every laugh he pretended not to hear. Every moment he watched other children run freely while he struggled just to move across a room. Those memories had slowly built a question that refused to leave him alone. What kind of future could someone like him possibly have? Nick began imagining the rest of his life, and the picture he saw frightened him. He believed he would never have a normal job, never fall in love, never have a family, never live the kind of life he saw everyone else living. The thought felt like a wall closing in around him. And one day, that feeling became too heavy to carry. Nick found himself alone in the bathroom of his home, sitting quietly beside the bathtub. The house was silent. No one knew what was happening inside his thoughts. For a moment, he wondered if the pain he carried would ever disappear. He wondered if the world might actually be better off without him. These were not dramatic thoughts. They were the quiet, dangerous kind that grow in the mind of someone who feels completely alone. But then another thought entered his mind. His parents. Nick imagined the look on his mother's face if she ever discovered that her son had chosen to disappear from the world. He thought about his father, about the years they had spent trying to give him strength. And suddenly, the silence in that bathroom changed. The same question that had haunted him for years returned again, but this time it sounded different. What if his life had a purpose he simply could not see yet? Nick did not walk out of that moment as a hero. He walked out as a boy who had decided, quietly and painfully, that he would keep living one more day. But sometimes, One decision like that is enough to change the direction of an entire life. Because the boy who once believed his story had already ended was about to discover something unexpected. The very thing he believed made his life meaningless would one day become the reason millions of people listened to him. After that night, nothing changed overnight. Nick still woke up in the same body. He still faced the same stares at school. The world around him had not suddenly become easier, but something inside him had shifted. It was small at first, almost invisible. Nick began paying closer attention to the people around him, and he noticed something he had never fully understood before. Everyone carried struggles, even the ones who seemed strong from the outside. Some students hid their pain behind jokes. Others stayed quiet, afraid of being judged. Some walked through life pretending everything was fine. For the first time, Nick realized he was not the only one fighting invisible battles. Around that time, a teacher asked him to do something unexpected. She asked if he would share his story with a small group of students. It was nothing big, just a few minutes in front of a classroom. No stage, no microphones, no audience of thousands. Just a handful of teenagers sitting in chairs. Nick hesitated. Standing in front of people had always been uncomfortable. Being seen had been the very thing that hurt him most growing up. But eventually he agreed. When the day came, Nick spoke about his life. He spoke about the stares, about the questions, about the nights when he wondered why he had been born this way. At first the room was quiet, but something unexpected happened as he continued speaking. Students who had never looked at him before were suddenly listening carefully. Some leaned forward, others lowered their eyes, as if they recognized pieces of their own struggles in his words. And when Nick finished, the room remained silent for a moment. Then one girl began to cry. She walked up to him afterward and said something he would never forget. "Your story helped me today." Nick did not fully understand it yet, but that moment planted a seed in his mind. For years, he had believed his life was proof that something had gone terribly wrong. Now, for the first time, he wondered if his life might actually mean something to someone else. And that single realization would slowly grow into something far bigger than Nick had ever imagined. Because that small classroom would eventually lead him to something extraordinary. One stage, then another, and another. Until one day, the boy who once felt invisible would find himself standing in front of thousands of people, all waiting to hear what he had to say. The small classroom where Nick first shared his story was not meant to be anything important. It was just a quiet moment in an ordinary school day. But sometimes the smallest moments become the beginning of something much bigger. Word about Nick's talk slowly spread through the school. A few teachers mentioned it to others. Then someone asked if he would speak again, this time to a larger group of students. Nick agreed, though he still felt unsure of himself. Standing in front of people had always been uncomfortable. For most of his childhood, being seen was the very thing he wanted to avoid. But this time was different. When Nick was placed on the small stage in the school hall, he looked out at dozens of students sitting in rows of chairs. Some of them whispered quietly, some simply stared, unsure of what they were about to hear. Nick took a breath and began to speak. He did not try to sound like a motivational speaker. He did not have polished words or dramatic stories prepared. He simply told the truth. He spoke about what it felt like to grow up without arms and legs, about the days he hated himself, about the nights he wondered if his life would ever matter. The room grew quiet as he spoke. Not the uncomfortable silence of shock that had followed him since birth, but a different kind of silence. The kind that appears when people are truly listening. Nick noticed something as he continued speaking. Faces in the crowd began to change. Some students nodded slowly, others wiped their eyes. A few looked down, as if they were hearing something they had needed for a long time. When the talk ended, the students did not rush out of the room the way they normally did. Instead, several of them walked toward him. One student said he had been thinking about giving up on school. Another said he felt like nobody understood his problems. But listening to Nick had made them see things differently. Nick sat there quietly, absorbing what was happening. For most of his life, he had believed that his story was something to hide. Now he was beginning to realize something unexpected. His story was not a weakness. It was a bridge. And that small stage inside a school hall would eventually lead him far beyond the walls of that building. Because the message that had touched a few students that day was about to travel much farther than Nick ever imagined. One invitation would lead to another. One small audience would lead to a larger one. Until the boy, who once believed he had no future, would find himself speaking to people across entire cities and eventually across the world. But the path from that first school stage to the world outside would not happen overnight. Nick was about to discover that sharing his story was only the beginning of a much larger journey. What started as a small talk inside a school slowly began to grow. At first, the invitations were simple. A teacher from another school heard about Nick and asked if he could come speak to their students. Then, a youth group invited him to share his story at a small gathering. Nick never imagined these moments would turn into something bigger. In the beginning, he was simply telling his story the only way he knew how, honestly. Each time he spoke, the reaction was similar. People listened quietly. Some cried. Others came up to him afterward to share their own struggles. They told him about the pressure they felt, the pain they carried, the doubts they had never spoken about before. For the first time in his life, Nick realized something important. Everyone was fighting a battle. Some battles were visible, like his. Others were hidden deep inside people's hearts. And suddenly, his life began to look different. For years, he had believed his body made him less than everyone else. But standing in those rooms, speaking to strangers, he began to see something he had never noticed before. His weakness was becoming his strength. Nick continued saying yes to invitations. Small groups turned into larger audiences. School halls turned into conference rooms. Churches invited him to speak. Youth events asked him to share his message. The more he spoke, the more people listened. But the real surprise came from something else. Nick discovered that when he stopped hiding his pain and began speaking openly about it, people trusted him more. They did not see him as someone broken. They saw him as someone who understood suffering. And that understanding created a connection stronger than anything Nick had ever experienced. One day, after a talk, a young man approached him with tears in his eyes. "I was thinking about giving up," he said quietly. "But hearing your story changed my mind." Nick never forgot that moment, because it was the first time he truly understood what his life might mean. The boy who once believed his story was nothing but tragedy was beginning to see it in a completely different way. His story was not just about survival. It was about hope. And that hope was about to carry him far beyond the places he had ever imagined visiting. Because the message that began inside a classroom in Australia was about to cross oceans. And soon, people in countries Nick had never even seen on a map would be waiting to hear his story. As the invitations continued, something unexpected began to happen. Nick's story started traveling farther than he ever imagined. At first, it was nearby cities, then different states. Soon, organizations from other countries began hearing about the young man from Australia who spoke about hope in a way people had never quite heard before. Nick began receiving invitations to speak across the world. The journey that once started in small school halls slowly expanded into something much larger. Airports replaced classrooms, conference stages replaced school podiums, and the audiences kept growing. Hundreds of people, then thousands. Nick stood before crowds in places he had once only seen on maps: America, Europe, Asia. Each new country brought new faces, new languages, and new stories from people who felt broken in their own ways. But something remarkable happened in every room he entered. It didn't matter where people came from. It didn't matter what language they spoke. The moment Nick began sharing his story, the room would grow quiet in the same way. People leaned forward. Some lowered their heads. Others wiped their eyes. Because the truth Nick spoke about was something everyone understood: pain, fear, and the deep human need to believe that life still has meaning. Nick often told audiences that he once believed he would never live a full life. He believed no one would ever fall in love with him, that no one would ever see him as more than a man without arms and legs. But life has a strange way of rewriting the stories we believe about ourselves. As his message spread across the world, Nick began to see something incredible. People were not inspired by his strength. They were inspired by his honesty. He did not pretend that life was easy. He did not hide the moments when he had felt completely lost. Instead, he spoke openly about those struggles. And that honesty created a connection that crossed cultures, borders, and languages. In city after city, people approached him after his talks. Some shared stories of depression. Others spoke about family struggles, addiction, or feeling invisible in their own lives. Nick listened, and each story reminded him of the boy he once was. The boy who had once sat alone in a quiet bathroom, wondering if his life had any purpose at all. Now he stood on stages across the world, watching thousands of people rise to their feet. But even as the world began listening to his message, Nick still carried one quiet doubt inside his heart. A question he had asked himself since childhood. Would anyone ever truly love him? Nick had spent years telling people that hope was real. Soon, life would give him the chance to discover that hope for himself. For most of his life, Nick carried a quiet belief deep inside his heart. He believed no one would ever truly love him. It was a thought that had followed him since childhood. Even when he stood on stages, speaking to thousands of people, even when crowds applauded his message, there was still a small voice inside him that whispered the same doubt. Who would choose a life with someone like me? Nick had learned to accept that some dreams might never belong to him. Marriage, a family, children. These were things he often imagined for others, but rarely for himself. Then one day, everything changed. Nick was invited to speak at an event in Texas. After the talk, as people gathered around him, someone quietly introduced him to a young woman named Kane Miyahara. At first, it was just a simple conversation. Nick had met many people after his talks before. Most conversations were brief, kind words, encouragement, maybe a photo, and then everyone returned to their lives. But something about Kane felt different. She listened, not with curiosity, not with sympathy. She listened with genuine attention, as if the story Nick shared mattered deeply to her. They talked for a while that day, and something unexpected began to happen. Nick noticed that Kane did not seem uncomfortable around him. She did not focus on what he lacked. Instead, she saw the person he had become. For Nick, that feeling was unfamiliar. For years, he had grown used to being seen first as a disability, then as an inspiration. But in Kane's eyes, he was simply a man. Their conversations continued. Slowly, friendship turned into something deeper. Nick found himself feeling something he had once believed impossible. Hope. But hope also brought fear. Because if this feeling was real, it meant risking something he had protected himself from for years. Love. One evening, after spending time together, Nick finally spoke honestly about the fear he had carried his entire life. He told Kane that he never imagined someone could truly love him, that he had spent years believing he would face the future alone. Kane listened quietly. Then she said something simple that Nick would remember forever. "I'm not choosing a body," she told him. "I'm choosing you." For the first time in his life, the doubt that had lived inside his heart for so many years began to fade. Nick had spent his life telling millions of people that hope was real. Now, standing in front of him was the proof. And the next chapter of his life would become something he once believed could never happen. A family. For years, Nick had told audiences around the world that hope was real. Now, he was beginning to live that hope himself. What started as friendship between Nick and Kane slowly grew into something deeper. Their conversations became longer. Their connection became stronger. And with each passing day, the life Nick once believed impossible began to feel closer to reality. In 2012, that impossible dream became real. Nick and Kane were married. For many people watching their story, the wedding felt like something more than just a celebration. It was proof that the fears Nick carried since childhood did not have the final word. The man who once believed he would always be alone was now standing beside someone who chose him not out of sympathy, but out of love. But life had one more surprise waiting for him. Not long after their marriage, Nick experienced another moment he had once believed would never happen. He became a father. The first time Nick held his son, the moment carried a weight that words could hardly describe. For years, he had wondered if he would ever build a family of his own. He had imagined a future where those dreams simply did not belong to him. Yet there he was, holding his child, looking down at a life that had only just begun. It was a moment that quietly rewrote everything Nick once believed about himself. The boy who had once asked his mother why he had been born this way had now grown into a man raising children of his own. A life that once felt broken had become something full and real. But Nick's story was never only about what he gained for himself. Because the message he carried, the one that began in a small classroom years ago, was still reaching people far beyond his own life. And that message had now traveled to millions. Years passed, and the journey that began in a small classroom continued to grow far beyond anything Nick had once imagined. He traveled from country to country, standing on stages in front of crowds that stretched farther than he could see. In some places, the rooms held hundreds of people. In others, thousands waited quietly for him to speak. Yet the message Nick carried never really changed. He spoke about pain. He spoke about fear. And most of all, he spoke about hope. Not the kind of hope that ignores suffering, but the kind that survives it. Nick often told audiences that life does not have to be perfect to have meaning. Every person carries struggles the world cannot always see, and those struggles do not have to decide the ending of their story. In every city he visited, someone would come forward afterward with tears in their eyes. Some had been fighting depression. Others felt invisible in their own lives. Many believed their circumstances would never change. Nick listened, and each story reminded him of the boy he used to be. The boy who once sat alone, convinced that his life would never matter. Now that same boy had grown into a man whose story had reached millions of people across the world. But even after traveling across continents and speaking to countless audiences, Nick understood something important. His story was never just about him. It was about reminding people that their story was not over yet. Over the years, Nick's story slowly grew into something much larger than a single life. People who had never met him began sharing his message. Videos of his talks traveled across the internet. Schools invited him to speak. Conferences placed his name on their stages. And in city after city, people gathered to hear the story of the man who had once believed his life had no future. But the strange thing about Nick's story was this. The part that inspired people the most was not his success. It was his honesty. Nick never pretended that life had suddenly become easy. He never hid the moments of pain that shaped his journey. When he spoke to audiences, he often returned to the same memories, the classroom where he felt different, the nights when doubt filled his mind, and the moment he almost believed his story had reached its end. Those memories never disappeared. Instead, they became the reason people trusted him. Because when Nick spoke about hope, it did not sound like a motivational slogan. It sounded like the voice of someone who had stood at the edge of despair and chosen to step back. That is why his message traveled so far. Students listened because they recognized their own struggles in his story. Parents listened because they saw the courage it took to raise a child in a world that did not always understand him. And people facing their own hardships listened because Nick reminded them that broken moments do not have to be the final chapter of a life. Slowly, without ever planning it, Nick's life became something more than a personal journey. It became a symbol. A symbol that strength does not always look the way people expect. A symbol that limitations do not always define destiny. And a symbol that even the most unlikely beginnings can lead to extraordinary endings. But perhaps the most powerful part of Nick's story was something much simpler than any speech he ever gave. It was the fact that the child who once asked why he had been born this way had grown into a man who helped millions of people see their lives differently. And in many ways, that might be the most unexpected ending of all. If someone had walked into that hospital room in Melbourne in 1982, the scene might have looked like the beginning of a tragedy. A newborn child lay under the bright hospital lights. He had no arms. He had no legs. Doctors struggled to find the right words. Nurses avoided each other's eyes. His parents stood beside the bed, facing a future no one could explain. In that moment, it would have been easy to believe that the story of that child had already been written. A life defined by limitation. A future shaped by everything he did not have. But life rarely follows the stories people expect. That same child would grow up to stand on stages across the world. He would speak to crowds of thousands, sharing the truth about pain, fear, and the courage it takes to keep moving forward. He would travel farther than anyone in that hospital room could have imagined. He would build a family he once believed impossible, and his voice would reach millions of people searching for hope in their own lives. Nick Vujicic was born without arms and without legs. But the story of his life was never really about what he lacked. It was about what he chose to do with what he had. Because sometimes the most powerful stories begin with circumstances that look impossible. And sometimes the child the world almost misunderstood becomes the person who helps the world understand itself a little better. Before you leave, I want to ask you one simple question. What word would you use to describe Nick's life? Write that word in the comments. And if you enjoy stories that reveal the strength of the human spirit, subscribe to the channel for more.